The air in Unit 734 was recycled, filtered to a state of near-perfect neutrality. It carried no dust, no stray pollens, no hint of the organic chaos that festered beyond the enclave's pristine white walls. For 10 years, Elian had breathed this manufactured purity, and for 10 years, his own internal atmosphere had been just as regulated. He woke not to an alarm, but to a subtle shift in the room's luminescence, a soft, clinical dawn that bleached the grey sheets of his narrow cot. The floor was cool and seamless beneath his bare feet, a single, unbroken plane of polymer that met the walls without corner or crease. Everything was designed to be sterilized, to be wiped clean of life's messy signatures. He was a part of that design. His routine was a silent meditation, a series of gestures worn smooth by 3,152 days of repetition. He stood before the mirrored panel of his sanitation unit. The reflection that looked back was a study in control. Pale skin, dark hair cut to regulation length, eyes the color of slate that held no particular light. There were no lines of laughter or grief etched around them. His face was a placid surface, and for a decade he had been grateful for its stillness. On the small, recessed shelf beside the basin, a single blister pack waited, one silver-backed pill, the suppressant. He pressed it out with his thumb, the small white tablet falling into his palm with a faint click that was loud in the conditioned silence. He did not need the glass of nutrient paste beside it, but ritual demanded its use. He placed the pill on his tongue, its taste a familiar, bitter chalkiness that promised another day of equilibrium, another day of quiet, another day of being a productive, compliant citizen of the Enclave. He was Curator Elian, designation 734, and his function was the orderly archiving of pre-Enclave historical data, a sanitized history for a sanitized people. He swallowed. The bitterness slid down his throat, a chemical promise kept. The faint, residual hum that was the baseline of his biology, the ghost of a designation he had not claimed since he was a boy, receded into nothingness. He was not an omega. He was not an alpha. He was not a beta. He was baseline. He was null. He was compliant. This was the gift of the Enclave, freedom from the tyranny of biology, from the disruptive, chaotic cycles of heat and rut that had torn the old world apart. Order, they called it. Peace. He dressed in the simple grey tunic and trousers of his station, the fabric smooth and cool against his skin, devoid of any scent but the faint, sterile tang of the reclamation unit. He was a ghost in a machine, and he had learned to find a strange, hollow comfort in his own invisibility. His work was his purpose. In the vast, silent halls of the archives, he was surrounded by the echoes of a dead world. He handled corrupted data streams, fragmented video logs, and ghost-written memoirs from an age of uncontrolled emotion. He catalogued wars, fought over scent matches, dynasties that rose and fell on the strength of a pairing bond, societies consumed by primal instinct. He saw it all through a lens of detached academic curiosity. The data was fascinating, a cautionary tale of what happened when the animal was allowed to rule the man. He was grateful for the sterile air, for the white pill, for the silence in his own blood. The summons came as a soft chime from the comms panel embedded in his workstation. The voice that followed was as smooth and sterile as the Enclave itself. Curator 734, report to Intake Sector Gamma. Your archival expertise is required for a new asset. The term asset was deliberately vague. It could be a piece of recovered technology, a corrupted data core, or on rare occasions, a living being recovered from the contaminated zones outside. Elian felt no flicker of curiosity, only a calm acceptance of the new directive. He logged out of his terminal, the screen fading to black, and walked the white, luminous corridors toward the intake sector. The air grew colder here, the hum of the facility's life support systems more pronounced. Gamma was a place of transition, the airlock between the pure interior and the contaminated exterior. It was a place of quarantine and analysis. The guards at the checkpoint were betas, their faces placid and unremarkable, their biology naturally inclined toward stability. They nodded as he approached, their scanners sweeping over his identification tag. "The director is overseeing this one personally," one of them murmured. "A rare breach of protocol." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Director Valerius rarely involved himself with the minutiae of intake. His presence signified an asset of extreme importance, or extreme danger. Elian nodded, his expression unchanging, and stepped through the final pressure door. The room was a stark white cube, dominated by a central containment cell made of transparent plasteel. Inside, a figure was seated on a simple metal bench, head bowed. Director Valerius stood before the cell, his back to Elian. He was a tall, slender man, always immaculate in his white director's uniform, an alpha of such disciplined control that his scent was a barely perceptible whisper of cool, clean ozone, a testament to his own high-grade suppressants. "Curator," Valerius said without turning. His voice was calm, melodic. "We have recovered a specimen from the outer territories, a feral alpha, unregistered, unsuppressed." Elian's gaze moved to the figure in the cell. The man was large, built with a lean, dense muscle that spoke of a life of physical hardship. His clothes were ragged, his dark hair long and matted. He was shackled at the wrists and ankles, the heavy magnetic cuffs glowing with a soft blue light. He had not moved. "He has refused all verbal communication," Valerius continued, his tone one of mild scientific interest. "His biological markers are potent. I need you to perform a sensory archive. Document his pheromonal output. We have no unsuppressed alpha data of this purity in our records. A sensory archive." The task was rare, usually reserved for botanical specimens or atmospheric samples. It required proximity. It required a temporary disabling of his own olfactory filters. Elian felt the first unfamiliar flicker of something in his gut. It was not fear. Fear was an inefficient, chaotic emotion. It was reluctance, a dissonant note in the placid score of his day. "Of course, Director," he said, his voice a perfect monotone. He approached the control panel beside the cell. He keyed in his authorization, and a small drawer slid open, revealing a diagnostic tool that resembled a slim silver pen. He took it, its metallic surface cold against his palm. "Proceed," Valerius ordered, stepping back to give him a clear path. Elian walked to the door of the cell. The magnetic lock hissed open. He took a preparatory breath of the clean, recycled air he had known for a decade. He stepped inside. The door hissed shut behind him, and the world ended. It was not a sound, not a sight. It was a scent. It was a physical force that struck him in the chest, stealing the sterile air from his lungs. It was pine needles crushed underfoot after a storm. It was the sharp, electric tang of ozone before a lightning strike. It was the smell of damp earth and wood smoke and something else, something wild and animal and terrifyingly alive. It was the scent of an alpha, a true, unbound, unsuppressed alpha. For a moment, His mind went blank. The scent bypassed all his training, all his conditioning. It was a key turning a lock he hadn't known existed deep within his own cells. The white pill in his stomach, the chemical dam he had trusted for 10 years, suddenly felt like a grain of sand against a tsunami. He felt a tremor start in his hands, a deep cellular vibration. The diagnostic tool felt slick in his grasp. The man on the bench lifted his head. His eyes were a startling, fierce gold, and they fixed on Elian with an unnerving intensity. He wasn't looking at a curator, he was looking at him. And in those golden depths, Elian saw a flicker of recognition, a shock that mirrored his own. A low growl rumbled in the Alpha's chest, a sound that resonated not in Elian's ears, but in his bones. The bitter, chalky taste of the suppressant rose in his throat, a failed ward against a primal god. A wave of heat, sharp and unwelcome, flooded his body, coiling deep in his belly. It was an echo, a ghost of a feeling he had read about in historical texts but had never, ever experienced. It was the beginning of a thaw, and it was agonizing. The scent was everywhere, a thick, inescapable presence. It was in his mouth, on his skin, in his blood. The quiet, orderly world of Unit 734, the placid reality he had curated for a decade, shattered into a million screaming pieces. He was not baseline. He was not null. In the suffocating, intoxicating presence of this feral alpha, the lie he had lived for 10 years burned away, leaving him raw, exposed, and utterly, terrifyingly awake. The silence in the cell was a living thing, stretched thin and humming with a tension Elian had only ever read about in censored pre-enclave literature. It was the silence of a predator and its prey, but the roles were terrifyingly unclear. The alpha, the asset, remained on the bench, his stillness a coiled spring of power. Only his eyes moved, tracking Elian's every microscopic tremor, the slight parting of his lips as he struggled for a breath that wasn't saturated with the alpha's scent. That scent. It was no longer just an aroma. It was an invasive force, reprogramming him from the inside out. Elian could feel the delicate chemical matrix of the suppressant dissolving in his bloodstream, the tiny soldiers of his manufactured peace falling one by one before an overwhelming, ancient onslaught. His mission, the reason he was in this plasteel cage, felt like a distant, nonsensical memory, a sensory archive. He was supposed to be the observer, the scientist, the detached cataloger of data, but the data was cataloging him. He raised the diagnostic tool, his hand shaking so violently that the silver pen scribed frantic, invisible arcs in the air. He needed to get closer. The thought was both a professional imperative and a terrifying, instinctual pull. Each step was a battle against his own rebelling biology. The polymer floor felt like mud, his regulation issue boots heavy as lead. The scent intensified with every inch he closed the distance, becoming richer, more complex. He could now detect undercurrents beneath the dominant notes of pine and ozone, the faint, metallic tang of dried blood, the salt of sweat from a body pushed to its limits, and a deep, musky warmth that spoke of pure, unfiltered vitality. It was the scent of life, raw and untamed, and it was the most obscene thing he had ever encountered in the sterile confines of the enclave. He stopped a prescribed 2 feet from the asset. He could feel the heat radiating from the alpha's body, a stark contrast to the cell's climate-controlled chill. He lifted the diagnostic tool, aiming its sensor tip toward the man's neck, where his pulse beat a steady, powerful rhythm beneath grimy skin. The alpha watched the device, but his gaze was fixed on Elion's face. A slow, predatory smile touched his lips, a flash of white teeth in a bearded face. It was not a gesture of humor. It was a look of profound, unsettling understanding. "You can smell it, can't you, little bird?" The voice was a low rasp, cracked with disuse, but vibrating with a resonance that made the hairs on Elion's arms stand on end. "The cage is breaking." Elion flinched as if struck. The words, the casual intimacy of the nickname, were a violation. No one spoke to him like that. Dialogue within the enclave was functional, precise. This was something else entirely. This was personal. He pressed the activation stud on the diagnostic tool. A thin blue beam of light projected from its tip, bathing the alpha's skin in a clinical glow as it analyzed the pheromonal particles in the air. On the tool's tiny display, alpha-numeric codes began to scroll at an impossible speed. Error, error, data overflow. The sensors were overwhelmed, unable to quantify the sheer potency of the output. It was like trying to measure a supernova with a candle. A wave of dizziness washed over Elion. The heat in his core intensified, becoming a sharp, insistent ache. His own scent, suppressed into non-existence for a decade, was beginning to stir. A faint, sweet fragrance he barely recognized, like bruised fruit and rain-wet stone. It was a terrifying betrayal by his own body. He could see the alpha's nostrils flare. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned, raw hunger. His golden eyes darkened, the pupils dilating until they were almost black. "There you are," the alpha whispered, the sound a ragged exhalation. "I knew it." Elion stumbled back, his heel hitting the cold plasteel wall. The diagnostic tool slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. The sound was deafening. He was losing control. The careful, placid construct of Curator 734 was fracturing, and the terrified, long-caged creature beneath was clawing its way out. He could hear a faint ringing in his ears, the sound of his own blood rushing. Through the transparent wall, he could see Director Valerius watching, his expression unreadable, his posture unchanged. He was an exhibit, pinned and mounted alongside the feral alpha, a matched set. The alpha pushed himself slowly to his feet. The magnetic shackles whirred, resisting the movement, but his strength was immense. He stood to his full height, towering over Elion, a primal force of nature contained in a sterile box. He took a step forward, then another, the chains clinking with a grim rhythm. He stopped just inches away, close enough that Elion could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the pulse hammering in his throat. The scent was a physical presence now, a crushing weight that made it impossible to think. "They starved you," the alpha murmured, his voice softer now, laced with a strange, rough sympathy. "They fed you poison and called it peace." He lifted a shackled hand, the movement slow, deliberate. He reached out, not to touch Elion, but to hover his fingers just over the pulse point on Elion's wrist. He didn't need to make contact. Elion could feel the heat from his skin, an invisible brand. "But you're still in there," the alpha breathed, his gaze locked with Elion's. "I can smell your soul." The ringing in Elion's ears became a roar. The ache in his belly clenched into a fist of fire. He saw the data streams from his archives flashing behind his eyes, images of bonding frenzies, of alphas and omegas lost to an instinct so powerful it rewrote their very being. It was history. It was a cautionary tale, and it was happening to him. He broke. A choked gasp tore from his throat, a sound of pure panic. He turned and slammed his fist against the plasteel door. "Let me out," he managed to say, his voice thin and reedy, a stranger's voice. "The asset is non-compliant. The test is a failure." Behind him the alpha laughed, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't cruel, but filled with a dark, bitter irony. "The test isn't a failure, little bird," he said, his voice a low promise that wrapped around Elian's spine. "It's just beginning." The door hissed open. Elian didn't wait for a command. He scrambled out of the cell, back into the sterile, neutral air of the intake sector, gulping it down like a drowning man. But it was too late. The alpha's scent clung to him, a phantom touch on his skin, an indelible stain in his lungs. He could still feel the heat, the pull, the terrifying awakening. As the cell door sealed shut behind him, he chanced to look back. The alpha was watching him, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, possessive light. He was no longer an asset. He was a catalyst. And Elian, for the first time in 10 years, was no longer compliant. He was terrified. Kyle tasted the Omega on the air before the cell door had even fully opened. It was a ghost of a scent, so faint and deliberately masked it was almost nothing. But to his heightened, feral senses, it was a symphony. It was the delicate fragrance of night-blooming jasmine after a cool rain, the subtle sweetness of a wild fig, and an underlying note of clean, sharp ozone that spoke of a deep, resonant sorrow. It was the most beautiful thing he had smelled in his life, a life that had been stripped of all beauty. He had been caged for weeks, transported in a sensory deprivation unit that was a white, humming hell. No light, no sound, no scent, but the metallic tang of his own fear and the recycled, dead air. They had tried to break him with nothingness, to erase the wild world from his senses. They had failed. The wilderness was not just around him, it was inside him. When they finally dragged him into this sterile, light-drenched box, the sudden sensory input was a shock. But it was a world of straight lines, of artificial light, of air that tasted of chemicals and filtration. It was a dead world. And then the door to his cell opened, and life walked in. He kept his head down, a practiced submission that had kept him alive during his capture. He watched the newcomer from beneath his lashes. The man was slender, dressed in the drab grey uniform of a drone, his movements precise and economical. He moved like a machine, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. But the scent was a desperate, secret scream. It told Kale everything. This was an Omega, so heavily suppressed that his own biology was a whisper in a hurricane of chemicals, a bird with clipped wings, taught to forget the sky. Kale felt a surge of rage so potent it was a physical blow, a hot spike behind his eyes. It was not directed at the Omega, but at the white-walled cage that had done this to him, that had taken something so vibrant and essential and tried to bleach it into nothing. He recognized the type. He'd seen them in the border towns, Omegas who had fled the enclaves, their bodies and spirits ravaged by years of suppressants, their instincts muted, their heats a painful, confusing sickness instead of a source of power. But this one was different. His scent, even buried under a decade of poison, called to Kale on a level that was deeper than instinct. It was a resonance, a perfect harmonic that vibrated in his very bones, a fated match. The irony was so bitter, it was almost funny. The architects of this sterile world, in their quest for order, had thrown the one person in existence who could shatter Kale's control into a cage with him. He watched as the Omega approached, his hand trembling as he held up a small, metallic device. He saw the flicker of confusion, then dawning horror in the man's slate-grey eyes as the first true wave of Kale's unsuppressed alpha scent hit him. It was like watching a statue crack. The perfect, placid mask fractured, revealing the panic beneath. The subtle tremor in his hands, the slight parting of his lips, the way his pupils dilated. Kale could smell the change in him, the first stirrings of his own suppressed scent beginning to bloom in response, a frantic, sweet perfume of fear and dawning awareness. It was intoxicating. Kale decided then that he would not be a passive specimen. He would be a catalyst. He would use their clinical experiment against them. He lifted his head, meeting the Omega's gaze, letting him see the intelligence there, the intent. He was not a mindless beast to be catalogued. He was a man, and he was an alpha who had just found the other half of his soul in the last place he ever expected. "You can smell it, can't you, little bird?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He chose the words carefully. Little bird was a risk, an intimacy that could shatter the Omega's composure. It was meant to. He needed to break through the layers of conditioning to speak to the cage thing inside. The cage is breaking. He saw the Omega flinch, the direct hit landing exactly as he'd intended. The man activated his device, the blue light, a pathetic, clinical attempt to quantify the force of nature that was Kale's pheromonal signature. Kale could almost feel the device overloading, its simple sensors incapable of processing the raw, unfiltered data of his existence. And then it happened. The Omega's own scent, a trickle at first, then a wave. Jasmine and fig and that heartbreaking ozone of sorrow, amplified now by sheer terror. It slammed into Kale with the force of a physical blow, bypassing his conscious thought and striking him directly in the primal core of his being. His instincts roared to life, a possessive, protective fury that demanded he claim, protect, and shelter this fragile, beautiful creature. Mine. The word was not a thought. It was an axiom, a truth that settled into his soul with the weight of eternity. "There you are," he whispered, the words torn from him, raw and unguarded. "I knew it." He had to get closer. He pushed himself to his feet, fighting the pull of the magnetic cuffs. The whirring protest of the mechanisms was drowned out by the roaring in his own ears. He crossed the small space, drinking in the Omega's scent, committing every nuance to memory. The man was backed against the wall, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost beautiful. He looked like a cornered forest spirit, all sharp angles and fragile grace. Kyle stopped, holding himself in check by a thread of will he hadn't known he possessed. His alpha screamed at him to close the distance, to soothe the Omega's fear with his own body, to mark him, to make the universe understand that this being belonged with him. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had survived the wilds and the Enclave's hunters, knew that would only break him completely. "They starved you," he murmured, pouring all the rough sympathy he felt into the words. "They fed you poison and called it peace." He reached out, his hand hovering over the delicate wrist, feeling the frantic pulse as if it were his own. He was connecting to him, scent to scent, soul to soul, across the sterile air. "But you're still in there," he breathed. "I can smell your soul." He saw the exact moment the Omega's control shattered. The grey eyes went blank with overload, the body rigid with a decade of repressed instinct flooding the gates. The choked gasp, the desperate flight to the door. It was the most honest, beautifully alive thing Kale had seen since his capture. When the Omega cried out to be released, it was not the disciplined report of a curator. It was the plea of a prisoner. Kyle's answering laugh was a dark, bitter thing. The fools. They thought they were conducting an experiment. They had no idea they had just lit a fuse. As the door hissed open and the Omega fled, Kyle held his ground. He let the man go. For now. The scent of jasmine and rain-wet stone lingered in the cell. A promise. He met the Omega's terrified gaze through the plasteel, letting his own eyes burn with the truth of what had just passed between them. A bond had been forged in this sterile cage, not of lust, not yet, but of something far deeper. A recognition, a resonance. The director, the white-clad phantom standing outside the cell, thought he was in control. He was wrong. Kel was no longer just a prisoner, and the little bird was no longer a compliant drone. They were variables the Enclave had not accounted for, and they were going to burn this sanitized, soulless world to the ground. The walk back to his unit was a study in disintegration. Elian kept his spine straight, his steps measured, his gaze fixed on the seamless juncture where the white floor met the white wall ahead. It was a performance of composure, a desperate lie told to the impassive optical sensors that tracked his every move. But inside, a civil war was raging. His body, his own treacherous flesh and blood, was a battlefield. A fever was building behind his eyes, a dry, prickly heat that had nothing to do with the Enclave's regulated temperature. His hands, hidden in the sleeves of his tunic, would not stop trembling. A fine, cold sweat slicked his skin, yet he felt as if he were burning from the inside out. And the scent. Gods, the scent. It was branded on the inside of his skull. Pine, ozone, wood smoke, alpha. It lingered in his nasal passages, a phantom presence that made the sterile, recycled air of the corridors feel suffocating and thin. With every breath, he expected to taste it again, and with every breath, the absence of it was a fresh kind of agony. He made it to his unit, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss that sounded like a final, damning judgment. He leaned against it, the cool metal a stark contrast to his own radiating heat. For a moment, he allowed his facade to crumble. His shoulders slumped, and a shudder racked his body, a violent, full-body tremor that started in his bones and worked its way out. He was sick. The suppressants had failed. No, they hadn't just failed. They had been annihilated, rendered utterly useless by a single, overwhelming dose of reality. He stumbled to the sanitation unit, his reflection in the mirror a horrifying stranger. His face was flushed, his pupils blown wide and dark, his lips parted as he panted for air. The placid, controlled mask of Curator 734 was gone. In its place was a creature of instinct, wide-eyed and terrified. He looked like the historical images he catalogued, the Omegas in the throes of a heat, their faces alight with a mixture of pain and ecstasy. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through him. He fumbled with the cabinet beneath the basin, his fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. He pulled out his monthly allocation of suppressant packs. The instructions were clear. 1 tablet every 24 hours. Deviation was grounds for disciplinary review. He ignored it. With trembling hands, he tore open a new pack, pressing out not 1, but 2 of the small white pills. He dry swallowed them, the chalky bitterness a desperate prayer. He waited, leaning over the basin, knuckles white as he gripped the edge. He counted his breaths, trying to force the familiar, placid numbness to return. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. The fire in his belly did not recede. The phantom scent did not fade. The trembling did not cease. The extra dose was like throwing a cup of water on a forest fire. Useless. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure despair. For 10 years, he had been safe in his chemically induced prison. He had traded the messy, unpredictable chaos of biology for the clean, simple lines of compliance. He had believed it was a fair trade. He had believed it was a choice. Now, he felt the bars of that cage rattling, and he was terrified of the thing inside, the thing that was him. His own biology, so long dormant, was reawakening with a vengeance. He could feel it, a slow, deep, insistent pull from his lower abdomen, a gathering warmth that promised to become a raging inferno. He could feel his own scent, faint but undeniable, clinging to his skin. Sweet, frightened, available. He stripped off his tunic, scrubbing at his skin with a coarse sanitation cloth, trying to wipe away the scent of the alpha, the scent of himself. But it was in his blood now, a permanent part of his chemistry. He was marked. Fragments of memory, long suppressed along with his hormones, began to surface. Whispers of a life before the enclave, the smell of real rain on hot asphalt, the warmth of a hand larger than his, holding his own. A woman's voice singing a lullaby, the words lost, but the melody a painful ache in his chest. These were not the sanitized data points of the archives. They were real. They were his, and they had been stolen from him. He had been told he was an orphan, a ward of the enclave, rescued from the chaos of the outer territories. He had been told the suppressants were a gift, a shield to protect him from the genetic weaknesses that had destroyed the old world. He had believed it all. He had been a good citizen, a compliant unit. The comms panel on his wall chimed, the soft, melodic tone cutting through his panic like a shard of glass. He froze. Curator 734, Director Valerius's voice purred from the speaker, as calm and unruffled as ever. A word, if you please. Elian stared at the panel, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could not refuse. He pressed the activation stud, his hand slick with sweat. Director, he managed, his voice a hoarse croak. He cleared his throat, trying to force it into its usual monotone. Director, I have been reviewing the data from your interaction with asset designation Kyle, Valerius said. The slight pause before the name was deliberate, a subtle twist of the knife. The diagnostic tool registered a catastrophic data overflow, and your own biometric readings, transmitted via your uniform sensors, are anomalous. Elian's blood ran cold. He had forgotten about the suit sensors. They knew. They knew everything. I believe the asset may have released some kind of airborne neurotoxin, Elian lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It caused a temporary system shock. There was a soft, indulgent chuckle from the speaker. It was the most terrifying sound Elian had ever heard. An interesting hypothesis, Curator. Creative. However, I have another. I believe we are witnessing a case of extreme pheromonal incompatibility, a 1 in a billion chemical reaction, the kind of biological determinism our great society was built to eradicate. Valerius paused, letting the words sink in. Your suppressants have failed, haven't they, Elian? The use of his name, his actual name, was a shocking, brutal intimacy. Valerius never used names. It was a calculated move, designed to strip away the last of his defenses. This is a remarkable opportunity, the director continued, his voice alight with cold, scientific curiosity. To study the old ways in a controlled environment, to observe the very chaos we have conquered. You are unwell, curator. You are running a fever. Your hormonal levels are spiking. You are, in essence, a walking, breathing piece of history. What do you want? Elian whispered, the performance of composure abandoned. I want you to continue your work, Valerius said smoothly. You will continue to interface with the asset. You will document your own reawakening. You will be both scientist and subject, a unique privilege. It wasn't a request. It was a death sentence, to be forced back into that cell, into the presence of that alpha in his current state. It would destroy him. I am not fit for duty, Elian protested, his voice weak. On the contrary, Valerius replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You have never been more fit for this particular duty. Consider it a promotion. Report to Intake Sector Gamma tomorrow at 0800. Do not be late. The connection clicked off, leaving Elian in a silence that was now filled with the sound of his own ragged breathing and the roaring of his blood. He was not a citizen. He was not a curator. He was an experiment, a specimen in a jar, and the director was about to start shaking it just to see what would happen. He looked at his reflection again. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something new was hardening. A cold, quiet cinder of rage. They had lied to him. They had used him. They had broken him. And now, they wanted to watch him burn. The feverish heat inside him was no longer just a biological symptom. It was the spark of rebellion. The second time Elian entered the cell, the air was different. The raw, overwhelming shock of the alpha's scent was gone, replaced by a low, constant thrum of it that had already permeated his senses. He had lived with the ghost of it for the past 20 hours. The reality was now a grim, familiar weight. His fever had not broken. If anything, it had settled deeper, a constant, low-grade burn that made his skin feel too tight and his thoughts slow and syrupy. The double dose of suppressants had done nothing but make his stomach ache. He felt raw, exposed, every nerve ending a live wire. He carried no diagnostic tool this time. His orders were different. He was to engage the asset in conversation, to compile a psychological profile while his own body's reactions were monitored remotely. He was the bait and the hook, and the fisherman watching from the shore. Director Valerius was a connoisseur of cruelty. The alpha, Kyle, was seated on the bench in the same position as before, but this time his head was up. His golden eyes tracked Elian's entry, and there was no smile on his face now. There was a look of grim assessment, a flicker of something that might have been concern. He could smell Elian's sickness, the scent of his failing suppressants and rising panic. It was a vulnerability that, in the old world, would have been a death sentence. They sent you back, Kyle said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. The white-coated ghoul wants to see what happens when you put a lit match in a room full of dynamite. Elian did not respond. He walked to the center of the cell and stood there, a silent, trembling effigy of compliance. His orders were to observe, to provoke, to document. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching this scene unfold from a great distance. This body, flushed and feverish, was not his. This terror, a cold, hard knot in his gut, belonged to someone else. My designation is Curator 734, Elian stated, his voice a strained, brittle monotone. You are Asset Kale. I am here to ascertain your origins and level of cognitive function. Kale let out a short, harsh laugh. Is that what you tell yourself? That you're still a curator? Look at you. You're shaking like a leaf in a storm. You're burning up. They're torturing you, and you're thanking them for the privilege. The enclave provides order, Elian recited. The words rote, meaningless. Biology is chaos. Control is peace. Is this peace? Kyle asked, his voice soft, insistent. He rose to his feet, a slow, deliberate movement that was mesmerizing in its coiled power. He took a step closer, and Elian flinched, taking an involuntary step back. This fear you feel, this fire in your veins, this is life, little bird. It's messy and it's terrifying, but it's real. What you had before wasn't peace. It was a coma. He was closer now. The scent was a thick, heady blanket, and it made Elian's head swim. The ache in his belly sharpened, a deep, rhythmic pulse that was starting to feel horribly familiar from the historical texts he'd studied. The first stage of an Omega's heat cycle. Preheat. It was impossible. It shouldn't be happening. Not this fast. Not to him. You are from the outer territories, Elian said, forcing himself to stick to the script, to the flimsy shield of his supposed mission. They are lawless, contaminated. They're free, Kyle countered. People live there. They fight. They love. They build things. They die. They have families. They have names, not numbers. Did you have a name before they gave you 734? The question struck a deep, discordant chord. A name. Elian. Valerius had used it. It felt strange and alien on his own tongue. A forgotten artifact. My designation is sufficient, he said, his voice wavering. Kyle took another step. He was only an arm's length away now. He moved with a predator's grace, but his eyes held no malice. They held a profound, aching pity. He's watching us right now, isn't he? The director. He's probably measuring your heart rate, your pheromone output. He thinks this is a science experiment. He doesn't understand that he's playing with the foundations of the world. The alpha's gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. He doesn't understand that a scent like yours and a scent like mine, they don't just react, they resonate. It's a song that, once started, can't be stopped. Elian squeezed his eyes shut. He could feel it, the resonance Kale spoke of, a vibration that seemed to run from the alpha's core to his own. It was terrifying. It felt like being erased and rewritten at the same time. He had to fight it. He had to maintain control. You are a feral, Elian whispered, the word an accusation, a desperate warding. Uncivilized, a threat to stability. And you, Kyle replied, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur, are a star that's been forced to forget it's a sun. They told you your light was a disease. They taught you to fear your own warmth. He was so close now. Elian could feel the heat from his body, see the pulse beating in his throat. The urge to close the final distance, to press his cold skin against that furnace of life, was so overwhelming it made him nauseous. He had to get out. He had to end this. The interview is concluded, he announced, his voice cracking. He turned to leave, to flee back to the hollow safety of the corridor. Kyle's hand shot out, not grabbing him, but gently closing around his upper arm. The touch was electric. A jolt of pure, unadulterated energy shot through Elian, so powerful it made his knees buckle. It wasn't violent. It was a simple, grounding touch, but it was the first skin-to-skin contact he'd had with another living being in a decade. His body reacted instantly, instinctively. A soft, involuntary noise, a keening sound of both pleasure and pain escaped his lips. His own scent, the sweet, rain-washed fragrance, bloomed in the air around them, thick and undeniable, a desperate, open plea. Kyle's grip tightened reflexively, his pupils dilating. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, possessive instinct. He was fighting himself. Alien could see it. The struggle was etched on his face, the tightening of his jaw, the cords standing out on his neck. He was holding back an avalanche of primal need. "Let go," Alien breathed, but the words had no force. "Please." Kyle's gaze dropped to Alien's lips, then back to his eyes. The battle in his expressions was stark. "If I let you go," he rasped, his voice thick, "you will walk back out that door and let them keep killing you slowly. If I don't, he will see it all." He, the director. They were a spectacle, a show for an audience of one. The realization was a splash of ice water. Alien found a sliver of strength, a shard of his old, disciplined self. He pulled his arm back, and to his surprise, Kyle released him. The loss of contact was a physical ache. "They didn't kill me," Alien said, the words a lie he desperately needed to believe. "They saved me." Kyle looked at him, and the pity in his eyes was devastating. "No, little bird," he said, his voice soft and full of a terrible certainty. "They just put you in a prettier cage than mine." Alien turned and walked out of the cell, not looking back. He could feel the Alpha's golden eyes on him, a physical weight on his shoulders. He could feel the ghost of a warm, strong hand on his arm. He was no longer a curator. He was no longer a number. He was a lit match, and he had just been thrown into a room full of dynamite. The only question was how long it would be until the explosion. That night, sleep was not a refuge. It was an ambush. Elian lay on his narrow cot, the regulated darkness of his unit a thin veil over the chaos brewing within him. The fever had intensified, and with it came the dreams. They were not the usual placid, grey voids of a suppressed mind. They were vivid, sensory-rich nightmares woven from fragmented memories and primal instincts he didn't know he possessed. He was running through a forest he'd never seen, the scent of damp earth and pine needles thick in the air. The ground was soft beneath his bare feet. Branches clawed at his skin, but he felt no pain, only a desperate urgency. He was being hunted. He could hear the heavy footfalls behind him, the snap of twigs, the low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the soles of his feet. But it was not a growl of malice. It was a growl of longing. He could smell the hunter, pine and ozone and wood smoke, Kyle. And he was not running away from him. He was running to him. He woke with a gasp, his body drenched in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled around his legs. The ache in his belly was a constant, insistent throb. His body was preparing for a heat he had been promised he would never have, a biological event he was completely unequipped to handle. The dreams had unlocked something else too, more flashes of the past, sharper this time, more coherent. A small room with peeling floral wallpaper, a window looking out onto a street slick with rain, the neon lights of a noodle stand reflecting in the puddles. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell the ginger and chili. And a face, a woman's face, her eyes the same slate grey as his own, singing to him. Her scent. It was faint, but it was there in the memory. Something soft and milky, like sandalwood and almonds. The scent of a mother, an Omega. The narrative of his life, the one the Enclave had so carefully constructed for him, was a lie. He wasn't a rescued orphan, a blank slate. He was a stolen child. The realization didn't bring grief. Not yet. The emotions were too raw, too new. It brought a cold, terrifying clarity. His entire existence was a fabrication designed to serve the Enclave's obsession with control. He was not a citizen who had chosen order. He was a specimen, cultivated from childhood for a purpose he was only now beginning to understand. He pushed himself off the cot, his legs unsteady. He needed information. The archives were his domain. For 10 years, he had curated the past of a forgotten world. Now, he would curate his own. Accessing the central server from his personal unit was strictly forbidden. But in the last few years, driven by a flicker of academic curiosity, he had mistaken for boredom. Elian had found backdoors, ghost protocols left by the system's original architects. He had never used them. It had been a theoretical exercise, a puzzle to occupy his orderly mind. Now, it was a lifeline. His fingers flew across the holographic interface of his terminal, the cool blue light painting his face in stark relief. He bypassed the standard firewalls, slipping through security layers like a phantom. He wasn't searching for data on Asset Kyle anymore. He was searching for himself. He typed in his designation, 734. The file that appeared was the one he knew well. His service record, his medical history, a neat, uncomplicated line of suppressant efficacy, his performance reviews. All clean, all sterile, all a lie. He delved deeper, using the ghost protocols to unseal the encrypted subfiles, the ones marked with the director's personal sigil. The screen flickered, and a new file opened. Designation, Project Chimera. Subject, 734. Origin, Sector 9, Outer Territories. Acquisition, age, 4 years. He scanned the clinical detached language. His parents were listed as subversives, leaders of a small community that refused Enclave assimilation. They were neutralized during a pacification action. He, a young Omega male showing high pheromonal potential, was deemed a valuable asset for study. He was not rescued, he was seized. He was spoils of war. He scrolled down, his breath catching in his throat. There were medical logs from his first years in the Enclave, records of the initial suppressant trials, his small body's violent reaction to the chemicals, fevers, seizures, periods of catatonia. They had almost killed him in their quest to save him from himself. And there, buried in a footnote, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. An observation from a junior researcher, later redacted and struck from the official record by Valerius himself. Subject 734 exhibits a rare genetic marker for pheromonal resonance. If ever exposed to a compatible alpha, standard issue suppressants will likely experience catastrophic failure. Recommend subject be permanently isolated or neutralized. He was not just an experiment, he was a ticking bomb. And Valerius had known it all along. The director hadn't been surprised by his reaction to Kale. He had been waiting for it. This was the culmination of a 20-year experiment. A cold, hard fury, unlike anything Elian had ever experienced, solidified in his chest. It was not the hot, chaotic rage he read about in the histories. It was a glacial anger, precise and absolute. He had been a ghost in their machine for a decade, a ghost they had created from the fragments of a murdered child's life. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not a number. He was a weapon they had unknowingly armed themselves. The screen before him displayed everything they had taken from him, everything they had done. He saw the cold, clinical text, but in his mind's eye, he saw a woman with slate-grey eyes and a man he couldn't remember, dying to protect him. He saw a little boy, sick and terrified, being poisoned day after day in the name of peace. He saw the curator he had become, a hollow man living a hollow life, mistaking numbness for safety. And he saw the man in the cell. Kyle, the feral alpha who had looked at him and seen not a number, but a soul. The catalyst, the key, the only other person in this sterile hell who saw the cage for what it was. Elian's hands stilled over the console. His path forked in this moment. He could erase his search history, go back to his cot, and wait for the director's experiment to run its course, to be consumed by a heat that would either kill him or break his mind. Or he could keep digging. He could use the knowledge he had, the access he possessed, and find a way to fight back. He began to type, his movements no longer frantic, but deliberate, precise. He searched for schematics of the Enclave, for security patrol routes, for vulnerabilities in the power grid. He searched for information on Intake Sector Gamma's containment protocols. He searched for a way out. The boy with the floral wallpaper and the singing mother was gone, murdered by the Enclave. The compliant Curator 734 was a fiction, a ghost that had just dissipated in the cold light of the truth. All that was left was Alien, and he was done being a victim. He was done being a specimen. The rage in his blood was a cold, clean fire, and he was finally ready to let it burn. Director Valerius stood in the observation gallery, a shadowy space that overlooked a dozen different sectors of the Enclave. The gallery was his sanctuary, a place of pure, omniscient control. One wall was a mosaic of screens, each displaying a silent, live feed. The quiet efficiency of the hydroponics bay, the sterile ballet of the medical labs, the placid, orderly flow of personnel through the main concourse. It was a world of his own design, a perfect ecosystem of compliance and order. And at its center, on the largest screen, was the feed from Intake Sector Gamma. He watched the two figures in the cell, his expression one of serene, intellectual curiosity. Asset Kale, the feral alpha, a beautiful, perfect specimen of the chaos they had sought to tame, and Curator 734, Ilian, his most promising and delicate long-term experiment. Valerius sipped his tea, a rare, organic blend from his private collection. The aroma was of bergamot and lavender, a subtle, controlled indulgence. He had been waiting for this for 20 years, ever since he had first read the file of the captured Omega boy with the rare genetic marker. He had overruled the cautious researcher who had recommended neutralization. To destroy such a unique variable would have been a crime against science. Instead, he had cultivated him. He had personally overseen Elian's integration, his education, his placement in the archives. He had given him a quiet, orderly, meaningless life, all the while knowing that he was a perfectly crafted glass vessel, waiting for the one sound that would shatter it. And now, the sound had arrived, in the form of a captured alpha from the very sector where the boy had been found. The symmetry was exquisite, almost poetic. Valerius felt a flicker of what a lesser man might call excitement. For him, it was the deep, satisfying pleasure of a complex hypothesis finally entering its experimental phase. His aide, a quiet beta named Lin, stood a respectful distance behind him. "Director," Lin said, his voice a soft murmur. "Curator 734's vitals are approaching critical levels. His core temperature is 38.9 degrees Celsius. Cortisol and pheromone levels are beyond the scale of our senses." "Excellent," Valerius replied, without turning. "The reawakening is proceeding more rapidly than anticipated. The subject's baseline resilience is remarkable." "There is a risk of systemic shock," Lin cautioned. "His system has been suppressed for over a decade. The sudden hormonal cascade could prove fatal. All discovery involves risk, Lin, Valerius said, his tone gently chiding. We are not simply observing a biological process. We are observing the collapse of a conditioned psyche, the battle between nurture and nature in its purest form. It is beautiful. He watched the screen intently. He saw the way Elian flinched from the Alpha's proximity, the way he recited the Enclave's creeds like a prayer against a demon. He saw the Alpha, Kale, responding not with aggression, but with a strange, calculated tenderness. It was fascinating. The feral was attempting to soothe, to connect, while the civilized man was recoiling in terror. The irony was delicious. And the asset, Lin asked. Kale's vitals are elevated, but stable. He is exhibiting classic signs of alpha possessiveness and protective instinct. He is, however, maintaining a remarkable degree of control. He understands the stakes, Valerius mused. He knows he is being watched. He knows that if he harms the boy, I will have him terminated. He is intelligent, far more than the initial field reports suggested. This makes the experiment all the more compelling. Valerius zoomed the screen in, focusing on Elian's face as he fled the cell after the second encounter. The terror in the Omega's eyes was exquisite, but beneath it, Valerius saw something else, a flicker of defiance, a hardening. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of the boy's mother, just before her termination. It was a genetic inheritance he had not counted on. Intriguing. That night, an alert chimed on his private console. Unauthorized access to the deep archives. A ghost protocol had been activated. The signature traced back to Unit 734. A slow smile spread across Valerius's face. He did not shut down the access. He did not dispatch a security team. Instead, he created a phantom directory, a false wall in the system. He began to feed Elian a curated stream of information, schematics that contained subtle flaws, security routes that were slightly outdated, protocols that had been recently revised. He would let the boy have his little rebellion. He would give him the illusion of hope, the belief that he could fight back. A cornered animal is predictable, an animal that thinks it has found a path to freedom. Its actions are far more varied, far more interesting to observe. Director, Lin's voice cut through his thoughts. I feel compelled to report this is a significant security breach. The curator has accessed classified files on Enclave infrastructure. I am aware, Lin, Valerius said calmly. Do not be alarmed. All variables must be allowed to play out. The boy is looking for a weapon. Let him think he has found one. It will accelerate the process. The process of what, sir? Valerius turned from the screens for the first time, his cool grey eyes fixing on his aide. The process of transformation, he said. For centuries, we have sought to sever the bond between Alpha and Omega, to free ourselves from the destructive whims of biology. We have succeeded, by and large, but we have never truly understood the nature of the bond itself. What is it? A chemical reaction? A psychological dependency? Or something more? He gestured to the main screen, where Elian was now back in his room, feverishly studying the false schematics. These two, they are the key, a perfect, resonant pair. The kind of bond that legends were written about, the kind that toppled empires. I want to see it forged in the crucible of this enclave. I want to see how strong it is. And then, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, I want to see if I can break it. Lin stared at him, a flicker of unease in his placid beta features. He saw only risk, chaos, the potential for the system to break down. Valerius saw only the beautiful, cold light of pure knowledge. He was not a monster. Monsters were driven by emotion, by malice. He was a scientist, and Elian and Kale were not his victims. They were his magnum opus. He decided it was time to escalate the experiment. The slow burn was yielding fascinating results, but true transformation required a catalyst of extreme pressure. It was time to remove the remaining barriers between his subjects. It was time to lock the match and the dynamite in the same room and see how brightly they would burn. "Lin," he said, turning back to the screens. "Arrange for a level 3 system failure in intake sector Gamma tomorrow. A full lockdown. Seal all doors. Cut all external comms. Ensure that Curator 734 is inside the containment cell with Asset Kale when it occurs." "For how long, Director?" "Indefinitely," Valerius replied, a hint of genuine excitement coloring his tone. "We will let nature, as they say, take its course." The air in the containment cell was thick with unspoken words. It was the third time Elian had been sent in, and the pretense of an interview or a diagnostic had been completely abandoned. He had been ordered to deliver the asset's nutrient paste, a menial task, a deliberate humiliation. He placed the tray on the metal bench, his movements stiff and awkward. His fever was a raging wildfire now, the pre-heat symptoms undeniable. His skin was hypersensitive, the rough fabric of his tunic an agony against it. A deep, persistent ache radiated from his lower back, and his thoughts were a hazy, feverish soup. He was losing himself, the edges of his consciousness blurring. He could feel the heat, his heat, gathering like a storm on the horizon. It would break soon, hours maybe, and he was trapped in a cage with the one person on the planet guaranteed to make it 1,000 times worse. Kyle watched him, his golden eyes dark with a concern that was almost as terrifying as the director's cold curiosity. He hadn't moved from his corner of the cell, deliberately keeping his distance, a gesture of respect for Elian's fragile state that was more intimate than any touch. "You shouldn't be here," Kyle said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "You need a safe place, a nest." The word nest sent a jolt of pure, shameful instinct through Elian, a primal urge to find a small, dark, defensible space and surround himself with soft things. It was a biological imperative he had only ever read about, and to feel it now, in his own body, was profoundly disturbing. "I am performing my duties," Elian managed to say, his voice thin and reedy. He needed to leave. Now. Every second he spent breathing this air, saturated with the Alpha's scent, the storm inside him gathered more strength. He turned to the door, his hand outstretched toward the control panel. And then it happened. A klaxon blared, a harsh, synthesized shriek that echoed through the sector. Red lights flashed, bathing the white cell in a hellish, pulsing crimson. A heavy metallic clang reverberated through the floor as emergency blast doors slammed into place. A synthesized voice, calm and detached, echoed from an unseen speaker. "System failure detected. Sector Gamma is now under Level 3 lockdown. All personnel remain in place. Containment protocols engaged." Elian froze, his hand hovering inches from the now-dead control panel. He stared at the sealed door, at the flashing red lights reflecting in the transparent plasteel. Locked in. He was locked in. A wave of pure claustrophobic panic washed over him, so potent it made him gag. He stumbled back, his legs giving way, and he slid down the cool wall to the floor. "No," he whispered, The word a prayer to a god he didn't believe in. No, no, no. This was not an accident. He knew it with a chilling certainty. This was Valerius. This was the escalation. Kyle was on his feet in an instant, crossing the cell in 2 long strides. He knelt in front of Elian, his large frame blocking the terrible, pulsing red light. The magnetic cuffs on his wrists and ankles glowed ominously in the dimness. "Breathe, Elian," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of the alarms. He used his name. It sounded right. It sounded like it belonged to him. "It's a setup. He wants to force a reaction. We don't have to give him one." Elian shook his head, curling in on himself, wrapping his arms around his belly as a sharp, vicious cramp tore through him. "You don't understand," he gasped, the words interspersed with ragged breaths. "It's too late. It's starting." Cale's expression hardened with a sudden, fierce understanding. He could smell it, the subtle shift in Elian's scent, as the preheat tipped over into a full, undeniable heat. The sweet fragrance of jasmine and fig was deepening, becoming richer, underscored by a new, musky note of pure biological need. It was a scent designed to drive an alpha mad. Elian could see the struggle in Kyle's face, the primal instinct warring with the conscious, intelligent man. His jaw was clenched, the muscles in his neck corded and tight. His own body was reacting, his scent thickening in the enclosed space, the pine and ozone becoming sharper, more possessive. The air in the small cell was becoming a potent, intoxicating cocktail of pure pheromonal desperation. "Okay," Kyle said, his voice strained. He backed away slowly, putting distance between them again. It was the hardest thing he could do, and the most necessary. "Okay, we can get through this. You have to fight it, Elian. Focus on me, not on the instinct. On me. Talk to me." But Elian couldn't talk. The pain was intensifying, no longer just an ache, but a sharp, twisting agony that stole his breath. His mind was fracturing, the rational, curated part of him losing ground to a rising tide of a sensation and need. The world was narrowing to this small, red-lit box, to the pain in his body, and to the overwhelming presence of the alpha across from him. An alpha who smelled like safety, like strength, like the only possible relief from the fire that was consuming him. A low, desperate keen escaped his lips, a sound he didn't recognize as his own. It was the sound of an animal in a trap. He looked at Kale through a haze of fever and pain, and for the first time he didn't see a threat. He saw a solution. His body, his treacherous, newly awakened body, was screaming at him to close the distance, to seek comfort, to submit to the instinct that promised an end to the agony. He started to crawl forward, his movements clumsy, driven by a force he could no longer control. "Elian, no," Kale said, his voice a harsh growl. He held up his shackled hands. "Don't. This isn't you. It's the heat. It's what he wants to see." "It hurts," Elian whispered, the words tearing from his raw throat. "Make it stop. Please." He reached Kyle's feet, his body trembling violently. He looked up, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He saw not a feral stranger, but a man in his own kind of trap, fighting a battle that was just as desperate as Elian's own. Kale looked down at him, his face a mask of anguish. His control was fraying. The instincts that Elian's heat sent were triggering, becoming an irresistible tide. He was an alpha, and a suffering Omega was calling to him. To deny that call was to deny the very core of his being. He sank to his knees, so they were face to face. The air between them crackled with a tension that was almost physical. "This is not how it's supposed to be," Kale rasped, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and longing. "Not in a cage, not for his entertainment." He reached out, his shackled hand shaking, and gently brushed a damp strand of hair from Elian's forehead. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shockwave of pleasure pain through Elian's system, making him arch his back with a soft cry. "I will not be his animal," Kyle vowed, more to himself than to Elian. "And I will not let you be his victim." With a surge of effort that made his muscles tremble, Kyle pushed himself back and sat against the far wall, putting the entire length of the cell between them. It was an act of monumental self-control. "We will wait it out," he said, his voice strained. "We will deny him his show. We will survive this, Elian. Together." Elian collapsed onto the floor, his body a knot of pain and frustrated need. The alpha's scent was a constant, agonizing temptation, but his words, his act of defiance, pierced through the fog of the heat. Together. It was a promise, a bond forged not just by biology, but by a shared will to resist. In the hellish, pulsing red light of their cage, surrounded by the scent of their own mutual, agonizing desire, they began their rebellion. Not with a fight, but with a quiet, shared endurance. It was a new kind of intimacy, more profound than any physical act. It was the intimacy of two souls choosing to suffer together rather than surrender alone. Time became a meaningless concept in the red-lit cage. It stretched and compressed, measured only by the waves of Elian's heat and the harsh rhythm of their breathing. The initial sharp agony subsided into a relentless, feverish torment. Elian's mind was a storm-tossed sea, his consciousness a small, battered boat. He drifted between lucid moments of stark, cold terror and long stretches of instinct-driven haze, where the only reality was the fire in his veins and the magnetic pull of the alpha on the other side of the cell. Kale did not move from his spot. He became a fixed point in Elian's disintegrating world, a dark, powerful silhouette against the pulsing crimson light. He spoke to Elian during the lucid moments, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the fever fog. He spoke of the outside world, of the smell of a real forest after rain, of the taste of roasted meat over an open fire, of the constellations in a sky unobscured by the enclave's light-polluted dome. He painted a world of sensory richness that stood in stark contrast to their sterile crimson prison. He was not just distracting Elian, he was giving him something to hold on to, a reason to fight. "They tell you it's contaminated," Kale's voice would murmur across the cell, "because they're afraid of it. They're afraid of anything they can't control. The wind, the rain, the way a seed pushes through concrete. Us." During the worst of it, when the heat threatened to consume him completely and his body begged for the relief only an alpha could provide, Kale would not speak. He would simply meet Elian's gaze, his own golden eyes dark with a shared pain, a shared defiance. He did not offer false comfort. He offered his presence, his unwavering solidarity. He was suffering, too. Elian could smell it in the air, the sharp, acrid tang of an alpha fighting his own instincts. His scent was a constant, low growl of frustration and a deep, resonant hum of protection. He was a guard on a wall, holding back a siege from within himself. It was in one of these moments of shared, silent agony that the bond between them solidified into something unbreakable. It was no longer just the chaotic pull of biology. It was a conscious choice. Elian, looking at Kale's face, etched with the strain of his control, understood. Kale was not just resisting his own instincts, he was honoring Elian. He was refusing to take advantage of his vulnerability, refusing to participate in Valerius's sick theater. He was treating Elian not as an Omega in heat, but as a person. In that moment, a profound shift occurred within Elian. The shame he felt for his own body, the terror of his reawakened biology, began to recede, replaced by a surge of fierce, protective gratitude. This man, this feral alpha, was more civilized than anyone in the pristine white enclave. This cage was a crucible, and it was burning away everything that was not essential. All that was left was the two of them, and the truth that hummed in the air between them. As the hours bled into what might have been a day or two, Elian's fever finally broke. The raging inferno in his body subsided to a slow, smouldering burn. The sharp, desperate edge of the heat passed, leaving behind a deep, resonant ache and a bone-deep exhaustion. His mind began to clear, the fog receding. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his muscles screaming in protest. Kyle watched him, his expression cautious. "Elian." "I'm here," Elian whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He was weak, drained, but he was himself again. The curator was gone. The frightened, feverish creature was dormant. What remained was someone new, someone forged in the fire of the last cycle. "We need to get out," Elian said, the words coming with a newfound certainty. "Not just out of this cell, out of the enclave." Kale's eyes lit with a fierce, burning hope. "I've been trying to get out since the day they brought me in. This place is a fortress." "Fortresses have flaws," Elian said. He thought of the schematics he had studied, the ones Valerius had fed him. Even if they were false, they were based on the truth. He had an architect's knowledge of this place. He knew its systems, its routines, its pressure points. "You have the strength," Elian continued, his voice gaining conviction. "I have the knowledge. The director thinks he's in control. He thinks we're predictable. We'll use that against him." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Kale's face. It was the first genuine smile Elian had seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly handsome. "A bird with a map," he murmured. "I like it. What's the plan?" The klaxon suddenly went silent. The harsh red light was replaced by the standard, clinical white luminescence. A soft chime echoed, and the synthesized voice returned. "System stable. Lockdown disengaged." The door to their cell hissed open. They were free. For now. Valerius was done with this phase of the experiment. He was letting them out of the small cage and back into the larger one, expecting them to be broken, cowed, or hopelessly bonded. He was expecting animals. He was about to be proven wrong. Elian met Kale's gaze across the cell. An entire conversation passed between them in a single, silent look. "It's time." Elian got to his feet, his body still weak, but his resolve like steel. He walked toward the open door, but stopped and turned back to Kale. "He'll separate us now," Elian said. "He won't let us stay together. Not after this." "He can try," Kyle growled, the sound a low promise. "It won't matter. We know now. The connection isn't just scent anymore." "No," Elian agreed, a strange, fierce joy blooming in his chest. "It's not." Guards appeared in the doorway, their beta faces impassive. "Asset Kale, return to your restraints. Curator 734, the director requires your presence for a debriefing." Elian took one last look at Kale, branding the image of him into his memory. The fierce defiance in his golden eyes, the raw power coiled in his stillness. Then he turned and walked out of the cell, his steps steady. He was no longer a specimen walking to be observed. He was a conspirator walking into the heart of the enemy's territory. The debriefing was a trap. He knew it, but a trap, once recognized, can also be an opportunity. The game had changed. Valerius thought he was the only player. He had forgotten that the pieces on the board had minds of their own. Elian walked the white corridors toward the director's office, a place he had only ever seen in schematics. The guards flanked him, their silence a heavy presence. He felt strangely calm, his exhaustion a dull ache beneath a sharp, cold focus. The heat had scoured him clean, leaving behind a clarity he had never known. He was no longer afraid of Valerius. He understood him now. Valerius wasn't a god. He was just a man with a cage, and his obsession with control was his greatest weakness. The director's office was at the very top of the enclave's central spire, its panoramic window a breathtaking, terrifying view of the sprawling, sterile city below. The room was a monument to minimalism and power. A single desk of black, polished obsidian, 2 chairs, and Valerius standing before the window, his back to the door, a silhouette against the perpetual, artificial daylight. "Leave us," Valerius said to the guards without turning. The door slid shut, leaving Elian alone with his creator and his tormentor. "Remarkable," Valerius said, his voice a soft, contemplative murmur. He turned, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. "You survived. I confess, I had my doubts. The mortality rate for a spontaneous, unassisted heat after a decade of suppression is significant." Elian said nothing. He stood in the center of the room, his posture no longer that of a compliant curator, but of an equal. He met the director's cool grey eyes without flinching. "You seem changed, Elian," Valerius observed, tilting his head with the curiosity of a scientist examining a new species. "The fear is gone. Replaced by what? Resignation? Or is it anger?" "It's clarity," Elian replied, his voice even and cold. "I know what you are, and I know what you did to me." Valerius's smile widened. "Ah, you found your file. I wondered if you would. Did it provide the answers you were looking for? A tragic, romantic backstory to fuel your little rebellion?" He gestured to one of the chairs. "Please, sit. Let us dispense with the pretense. You and the Alpha. You have formed a bond. A powerful one, I surmise. The kind my predecessors believed was a myth." Elian remained standing. "You locked us in a cage and tried to force us to behave like animals. Is that the data you were hoping for?" "It was one possible outcome," Valerius admitted, moving to sit behind his desk. He steepled his fingers, his gaze analytical. "A predictable one. What you did instead, what he did, was far more interesting. The feral Alpha displaying a level of control and strategic restraint that was frankly astonishing. And you finding a core of resilience I hadn't anticipated. You did not break. You annealed." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with intellectual fervor. "So tell me, what does it feel like? This legendary bond? Is it a comfort, a prison of its own? Do you feel his every emotion? Is your will still your own, or are you merely a slave to a biological imperative?" The clinical questions, the complete lack of empathy, did not anger Elian. It confirmed everything. To Valerius, he was not a person. He was a puzzle to be solved. "What do you want, Director?" Elian asked, cutting through the psychoanalysis. "I want to continue the experiment," Valerius said simply. "Phase 2. I want to see how your bond functions under different kinds of stress, separation, reintegration into the collective, the introduction of a rival stimulus. The words hung in the air, a cold, clinical threat. "I will not be your lab rat," Elian said, his voice low and dangerous. Valerius laughed, a soft, airy sound. "My dear boy, you have been my lab rat for 20 years. You just didn't know it. You have no choice. You are a citizen of the Enclave. You have nowhere to go. The Alpha is my prisoner. I control every aspect of your existence, your food, your water, the very air you breathe. What can you possibly do?" This was the moment, the pivot point. Elian had spent the walk here going over the flawed schematics in his mind, cross-referencing them with the Enclave's daily energy consumption reports, which he, as a curator, had access to. He had found it, a single critical vulnerability, not in the walls, not in the guards, but in the system itself. "The main reactor core," Elian said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Its energy recycling system has a cascade failure point. If the primary and secondary coolant regulators are disabled simultaneously, the system won't just shut down, it will overload, a full system meltdown in under 5 minutes. Valerius's smile faltered for the first time. A flicker of something, not fear, but surprise, crossed his features. "An interesting, if suicidal, piece of trivia. How did you deduce that?" "You taught me to be a good archivist," Elian said, "to find patterns in the data, and you fed me the breadcrumbs yourself." He took a step closer to the desk. "I have jury-rigged a remote trigger using the ghost protocols you left open for me. It's linked to my own biometric signature. If my heart stops, or if I don't input a deactivation code every 90 seconds, the sequence begins." The director stared at him, his mask of serene control finally cracking. He was seeing not a specimen, but a threat, a variable he had not just miscalculated, but actively armed. "Checkmate," Elian said softly. "You think threatening the lives of everyone in this enclave, including your own, is a victory?" Valerius scoffed, recovering his composure. "It's a stalemate," Elian corrected. "And I'm about to state my terms. You will release Kale. You will give us unrestricted access to the outer airlock in Sector Gamma. You will provide us with a transport and enough supplies for a week." "And why would I do that?" Valerius asked, his voice laced with venom. "Because the alternative is that we all die together in a blaze of your glorious controlled order," Elian said. "And I know you, Director. You are too much of a narcissist to let your magnum opus be destroyed. You would rather let 2 lab rats escape than see your entire laboratory go up in flames." A tense, humming silence filled the room. Valerius studied Elian, his mind racing, recalculating, reassessing. He had wanted to see what would happen when he pushed his experiment to the breaking point. This was what happened. A rebellion not of passion, but of cold, hard logic. An Omega using the very tools of the system to tear it down. It was, in a way, the most fascinating result of all, finally. Valerius leaned back in his chair, a slow, cold smile returning to his face. It was a smile of genuine, if perverse, appreciation. "Well played, curator," he said. "Well played indeed. You have my attention. You may have your freedom." He pressed a button on his desk. "Lynn, release Asset Kale. Escort him and Curator 734 to the Sector Gamma airlock. Give them what they ask for." "But, Director," Lynn's voice protested over the comm. "Do it," Valerius commanded, his eyes never leaving Elian's. The game was not over. He was merely letting his queen leave the board, for now. An escaped specimen was still a specimen. and the outside world, he knew, was a laboratory all its own. Elian did not trust him, not for a second, but it was the only move he had. He gave a slight nod, turned his back on the director, and walked out of the office, his heart hammering out the 90-second rhythm of his own fragile, hard-won freedom.